2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
And a big warm welcome to Dr. Jim Joes, Associate Professor in Politics here at the University of Newcastle. Can I call you Jim, Prof? Or do you prefer as Prof, or what do you like?
Jim's just great.
Jim's going to work for us?
Jim works well.
Good. Otherwise, for the next 4 weeks, I might end up calling you a whole combination of things that might not work out so well.
I'm sure they'll be fine.
Well, hello and welcome. The Abbott government seeing a bump in polls post-budget. This is a big turn of events compared to 12 months ago, Jim.
Well, certainly, I think that's a reasonable comment. The bump in polls, depending on which poll you take, one poll has them, the Coalition and the Labor Party neck and neck after preferences are distributed. Another poll, the News poll, has them slightly more favourable to the Labor Party at present. But overall, I think you'd have to say that the response to the budget in terms of polling has given Tony Abbott a fairly good period of, shall we say, comfort zone for the time being. It's certainly probably taken some of his critics off his back within the party. He could focus on, as he puts it, moving forward or pushing forward or going forward. The Labor Party is probably a little less happy about this because not only have their stocks remained static, in both polls they've remained more or less the same. In the preferred leadership stakes, both leaders, Tony Abbott, Bill Shorten, are neck and neck. And in terms of preferred Prime Minister, Tony Abbott has been on a 6-month increase. He's actually been improving every month for the past 4 or 5, 6 months. So he'd be very happy at the moment.
I did happen to look at the Fairfax Ipsos poll that came out, and they have him at 8 percentage points up since April. So that's quite a bump, really, isn't it?
It certainly is.
Looking at that.
Sorry, Meryl. I mean, whether that translates into
votes
when it comes to the next election, but I think he's fairly cagey but consistent at the moment. There's really no need for him to be pushing towards an election. He's got at least 12 months, perhaps he's got another budget to come, and he doesn't need to go to the polls. Depends on how the Senate operates and how the Senate deals with some of the measures, and it also depends in part on how the government prepares its current budget measures and some of its past budget measures, which are still very controversial and are still not well received by the Senate.
It's interesting. I think the new Greens leader, Dr. Richard Di Natale, has said that would be the canary in the coal mine. If there was moves for changes to the way the Senate is set up and elected, then that could be the signalling that we are in fact going for a double dissolution off to the polls experience.
Well, I think so. There are two things I think that I would say to that. The first is if the government is not careful and it tries to pull a few fast ones by tacking on unpopular measures to more popular measures and to slide them through the Senate and to try and wedge the Senate crossbench to some extent, that will be a signal that the government is beginning to gear up to perhaps pressure towards an early election. The other one would be if they make changes or try to make changes to the voting procedures for getting people elected to the Senate. And that's going to be much more difficult because there's no agreement. In fact, the coalition needs the Labor Party in particular to assist them in this role, but the Labor Party sees some degree of electoral disadvantage that every crossbench member that gets elected usually does so at the expense of the Labor Party, the coalition. So they see a little bit more in their favour by keeping the status quo. Whether that will be something that they are able to sustain, because it's really a little hard to take that someone with less than a quota, that's to say the less than the required number of votes to be elected, in some cases 1% of the vote, actually has representation in the Senate. That's probably distorting the process. Having said that, I'd also say having a number of independent people in the Senate is good for democracy insofar as governments have to negotiate, or should be trying to negotiate, to get their political agenda legislated and through both houses of Parliament.
One of those people, of course, is Glenn Lazarus, who's the defector from the Palmer United Party, and I see that he's starting a party of his own called the Glenn Lazarus Team. It's almost got a football feel to it. The logo looks like a football logo. It's interesting. It's really appealing to a different position that we've never seen before in the Senate. You know, senators have almost, to a certain extent, I think, you know, Paul Keating described them as unrepresentative swill, but they've stayed in the background a lot. It seems like there's a big push from the Senate now to be much more public and capture the public's attention.
The Senate, yes, the Senate has always been a bit of a thorn in the side of governments. Governments
Funny thing,
are
though.
hostile to the Senate when they don't have the numbers in the Senate. When they have the numbers, they're quite happy with
Yes.
it. Now, the current Senate and some past Senates have had a crossbench in which governments have had to work with them in order to get their legislative agenda through. And it's interesting, you know, that we have a number of Palmer United Party senators who are now forming their own parties, but their parties have won in terms of representation.
Yes, it's really...
It's quite strange.
It is quite strange. So what do you think, broadly in closing, Dr. Jim Jones, is on the horizon? We're not going to an early election, that's your sense?
For the time being, I
Okay.
think probably for the next 3 to 6 months, it like I said, it will depend partly on how hostile the Senate becomes, whether Tony Abbott has learnt something about negotiating and being able to bring some of the crossbench senators back on side for most of the time. He doesn't need to win every issue. He only needs to get the important things through. And that will take a little bit more finesse than he's shown in the past. However, the current budget shows that the coalition or the government has perhaps learnt a little bit from its past mistakes. It's brought down a budget that most people, at least on the surface, think is going to be okay. What lies beneath it, that's in a whole other set of issues. Similarly, the next step is to win over some of the crossbenchers to the coalition agenda for most of the sorts of things that they want. If they try to get too clever by half, it will all fall apart, and that might spur the government into thinking, okay, the only way we're going to get around this is to force them all to the polls.
Yeah, clean them out.
Yeah. The next election, when it happens, the standard election, Meryl, will still be a half Senate election, but it's going to possibly reproduce the last half Senate election outcomes in which we get even more
Independence
crossbenchers,
and-
which
yes.
make it even harder. So I think that at the back of the government's mind there is, how can we manoeuvre to a double dissolution effectively? But they've got electoral reform in the Senate on the one hand, and they've also got redistribution issues on another, which perhaps we might talk about next week.
I was going to say, let's pick that up next week, because that's something that possibly, I know it's remote, but it could involve 2 Hunter seats, Newcastle and Shortland, but it's remote. But let's pick up on that next week. Dr. Jim
Certainly.
Jones, thank you so much for your
My
time.
pleasure, Meryl.
Associate Professor Dr. Jim Jones from the University of Newcastle, chatting with politics, and we'll pick up that thread next week.